The last kind of law that we're going to look at from Aquinas is the third kind. So we considered the eternal law. We spent a lot of time looking at the natural law, and now we're going to look at what he calls the human law. There's, of course, a fourth kind of law, the divine law, but we talked about that earlier, and we're not going to look at it in any kind of detail. It's an explicitly kind of theological kind of law that's been revealed explicitly and directly by God, not of our not part of our concern in this course. All right, the human law. By the human law, what Aquinas is talking about is laws that human beings make and pass themselves. So it's what we would typically think of when we just think of laws. When you think of the laws of the United States, the laws of Illinois, and so on. Those are human laws. Those laws count as human law in Aquinas's view. Human law is made not by God. God is the authority who makes the natural law, who makes the eternal law, who makes the divine law. Human law is not made by God. It's made by human beings. It's made by legislatures and so on. And so what we're going to try to understand is how the human law fits into this picture. And this is really in this picture of law that Aquinas has more generally, and more specifically, how it ties into the natural law, because that's Aquinas's main focus. And he begins his discussion with the question of, why is the human law even necessary? After all, he's just finished. So the human law is discussed in question 95, and in question 94 he's just gone on at length about the natural law, and the natural law is known by everybody. Everybody knows the natural law, and the natural law contains these prohibitions on murder and stealing and so on. And so why do we even need a human law? Why is human law necessary? Isn't it just kind of superfluous or odious or whatever, right? It's kind of going above and beyond it. You don't need it. Aquinas wants to say two things here. It's going to be necessary for two reasons. What's going to be in the background is his idea is that just because everybody knows the natural law, just because it's written in everybody's hearts, that doesn't mean everybody follows it. And so in Aquinas' view, the natural law is something kind of known, but not necessarily put into action, not necessarily motivating. We know that you ought not steal, but still people steal. This is going to be why human law is necessary. So in the first place, what Aquinas states, and this isn't really the primary reason why human law is necessary, but it's certainly one reason why it's necessary. Human law is going to keep evil people, through fear of punishment, from doing evil things, from harming other people. So, take someone who would murder and steal and do all other kinds of nasty things. They know, Aquinas thinks, they know in some sense that what they're going to do or what they would prefer to do, they know that murdering and stealing is wrong because they know the natural law. It's written on their hearts. They know that. Nonetheless, they might still murder and steal and so on, knowing that it's wrong. What human law can do is impose certain very harsh penalties on violations of the natural law, say, on murdering and stealing and so forth. And these very harsh penalties might dissuade or keep evil people from doing these evil things. They would just go and steal whatever it is they want, but they'll refrain from doing it because they don't want to get caught and they don't want to have to deal with all that trouble, and they don't want to go to jail. They don't want to be punished and so on, right? And so human law is important for this reason, right? Violations of the natural law in themselves right now in this life don't carry any punishment. If there were no human law and you were to go violate the natural law and get away with it, right? And you go steal somebody's things or whatever and you run away, no punishment. What human law does is put in place a kind of system of punishment. It makes explicit that there will be a punishment, and puts in place the system or institutions that will what's the word, that will make sure that that punishment is kind of dealt out. And so this has a deterrent effect, Aquinas wants to say. And so that's one reason for a human law. Not the primary reason. The primary reason in Aquinas's view seems to be the second thing that he mentions. Second reason that he mentions. Human law is necessary because, again, it's he's going to pick up on this idea of fear of punishment. And again, he's going to be looking at evil people, right? Human law is necessary because people are going to break the natural law, right? That's the idea. And so we want human laws that have real world or this world punishments attached to them. To keep evil people from harming other people, disturbing the peace, right? That's number one. But in the second place, it's to help evil people become better. It's to help inculcate virtue in them. And what he's drawing on here is Aristotle's notion, Aristotle's view of how moral virtue is acquired. So if you recall our discussion of Aristotle thought that you acquired moral virtues such as generosity and justice and so forth through habituation. And so it was through repeated practice. So by doing just things over and over and over, doing the just thing becomes a habit. We become habituated to it. And then we come to find pleasure in doing it because we find pleasure in what we're habituated to. And then we tend to do the things we find pleasant. And so we get on this self-reinforcing circle, right? But to get on that circle in the first place, Aristotle's idea is that you need to have some sort of guidance. You need to have a teacher, right? You acquire the moral virtues in the same way that you acquire a skill or a craft. And to acquire a skill or a craft, right, it takes practice, but it takes guided practice. You need a piano teacher or whatever. Well, in the case of the moral virtues, you'll remember, you don't need a piano teacher. You need a parent. Your parents are your teachers into the virtues. They're the ones who habituate you, who make you act this way. And then, if you think about it, I think, there's something intuitive that makes a lot of sense about that. Parents can kind of direct and control their children's behavior, and so have them act in one way as opposed to another, and so inculcate certain habits, certain characters in their children. Aquinas's idea here is almost exactly the same, except it's not parents and children, it's the law and the people, adults, right? And in particular, adults who would perhaps be tempted to break the natural law. And so his idea here is that the law, if there's sure enough and harsh enough punishment, will perhaps keep evil people from doing evil things. And by having them refrain from doing evil things, it might habituate them, rehabituate them to not do evil things, to become better people. It might break their habits for unjust action by having them refrain from it, right? Because that's a kind of action. And if the law makes people do that over and over, well, it might rehabituate them, right? That's Aquinas's idea. And so instead of having parents guide you into the virtues, it's the law that's supposed to educate you into the virtues. And it applies to all citizens, young and old. But what's particularly noteworthy about it is that it applies to adults, citizens who are old, not just children, right? And so it's like a further uh, uh, um, a further guide for virtue is Aquinas's idea. That's really what human laws are supposed to do. After all, he's been making a big deal, as we saw in the earlier questions on law, when he's talking about law in general, and then also question 92, which we didn't discuss explicitly at any time. But the law, the purpose of the law, especially laws that relate to human beings, is to make human beings good. That's what they're supposed to do. And here we see that coming out in full force, right? Human laws are supposed to make people good. And here's how they can do that: by habituating evil people to be better, right? That's his idea. That's why human law is necessary. So it's going to be useful. It's going to help make people better. Yeah, that's Aquinas' idea. Now, after discussing why human law is necessary, Aquinas goes into more detail about what exactly the relationship between the human law and the natural law is. As I've already been talking about, I've kind of been saying, well, the human law punishes violations of the natural and so on, right? Kind of shifting back and forth between human law and natural law. So what exactly is the relationship here? How exactly do they relate to one another? Aquinas's claim is that the human law stems from the natural law. And what he goes on to discuss here, and this idea more generally, the idea that human law stems from the natural law, has been, it's hard to overstate the influence of this idea. So we're going to look at Aquinas's details of what exactly he wants to say, what exactly he means by this, and it's going to look all nice and good, and like you might think, okay, fine, but then we're going to consider, and this is what we'll close with, and going to kind of consider the influence of this idea to hopefully make it come alive a little bit more. Because one thing that you might have gathered from Aquinas's presentation of ideas, the way he presents ideas, he does it in a very kind of abstract, dry way, making distinctions, clarifying the distinctions. And when somebody writes like that, it's very easy to lose sight of the import of what they're saying. So we'll try to see what the import of this idea is after I explain what the idea is. So the human law stems from the natural law, and it stems from it in two ways. In the first way, the human law stems from the natural law as conclusions. Human laws stem from the natural law as conclusions of the natural law. What exactly does that mean? His idea here is that the human laws, or at least many of the human laws that stem from the natural law in this way, I should say, can be derived from the natural law. They are just kind of, they can be derived from the natural law. You can see how the natural law kind of entails them. So, for instance, we have human laws that forbid murder, right? It's against the law of the United States. It's a federal crime to murder a person. It's also against Illinois state law to murder people, right? So we have human laws against murder. And what Aquinas would want to say is that those human laws, let's just focus on the U.S. law, the federal law against murder, that is a conclusion derived from the natural law that forbids doing evil. So the natural law, the first precept of the natural law, you'll recall, requires doing good and avoiding evil. Forbidding murder is just something that we can derive as a conclusion from the fact that the natural law says don't do evil. So if the natural law says don't do evil, well, we can conclude and we can enshrine it in law that you ought not murder. Now, what Aquinas says is that the human laws that stem from the natural law as conclusions overlap with the natural law. And so this can be a little bit confusing. The human law that forbids murder is a conclusion derived from the natural law that forbids doing evil. One thing you might think is, I thought the natural law forbidded murder. And Aquinas say, yes, it does. And so both the natural law and the human law forbid murder. When you have human laws that stem from the natural law as conclusions, Aquinas wants to say that the human laws kind of get their force from the natural law as well. And what that means is that the natural law also forbids what the human law forbids, right? So the natural law also forbids murder. And so in this case, what we really find is overlap between the human law and the natural law. And so when the human law stems from the natural law as a conclusion, another way of saying that is that the human laws just state some of these secondary precepts of the natural law. So these secondary precepts of the natural law included things like don't murder, don't what I don't know, don't steal, things like that, whatever. Yeah, those are secondary precepts of the natural law, and they're also human laws. Humans' laws stemming from natural laws like that are going to overlap with secondary precepts. Now, Aquinas is not committed to saying, and in fact, he denies this in certain places. He denies that every secondary precept of the natural law should also be a human law. He doesn't think that that's true. We're not going to get into the reasons why. So, for instance, right, there's a secondary precept of the natural law is that we should pursue knowledge. Say, is Aquinas committed to saying that we should make a human law that requires everyone to, get PhDs to pursue knowledge? No, he's not going to say that, right? Just because something is a secondary precept of the natural law doesn't mean there must be a human law that follows it. And kind of very famously, Aquinas thought that I think he put it in terms of, I can't remember now, and I shouldn't say, but I think like laws forbidding adultery. Adultery is contrary to the natural law, according to Aquinas. You could find it under I'm sure he would locate it under the natural inclination for kind of family life, reproduction, rearing of children, and so on. What's going to be entailed by all that is the wrongness of adultery. It's a kind of a disruption of the family, something like that. But I don't. But Aquinas, I don't thinks that there should be a law against adultery. There are going to be right. He doesn't think that there should be a human law against it. And so the natural law outlaws it, but that doesn't necessarily mean there should be a human law against it. Okay. Second way in which the human law stems from the natural law. So in that first way, you might just have overlap. Basically, is what he's saying, right? The human laws might just be more or less statements of the secondary precepts of the natural law. The second way in which the human law stems from the natural law is as specifications. The human law that and so here's one of Aquinas' examples. According to Aquinas, the natural law claims that evildoers should be punished, right? So somebody who's really evil, who's done something really bad, needs to be punished. But it doesn't specify how they should be punished. That's something that's left for human law, right? And so it's not even contained anywhere in the natural law, either in the first precept or in the secondary precepts, how exactly an evildoer should be punished. Rather, the human law is going to contain that. And so we don't find overlap here, right? Because the human law is going to say something like, just to use an example, right, that for murder, you should serve 25 years in prison. Let's say that that's what the human law states. That is nowhere stated in the natural law, that specific information, right? And so it's a difference here. Human law stemming from the natural law as a specification is different from human law stemming from the natural law as a conclusion. Because in the conclusion case, we saw overlap. Don't murder. That's the natural law. Don't murder. That's the human law. But here in the second case, as specifications, the natural law is, well, evildoers should be punished. And then the human law, it follows from that. It stems from that. But there is an overlap because the human law is something different. It says one should serve 25 years. It's more specific. Yeah, that's the idea. But it still kind of stems from it. It's specifying the content of the natural law. That's the idea. So you either have overlap or specification of content. That's how the human law stems from the natural law. Okay, so that's pretty much all Aquinas has to say about the human law. And so we've covered why it's necessary. We've covered what it is in the first place. We've covered why it's necessary, and we've covered how it relates to the natural law. And what we've seen in this third item, how it relates to natural law, is that there's a very, very close relationship. Right? The human law stems from the natural law. This idea, as I said at the outset, hugely influential. um, One of the people he cites in discussing this is St. Augustine. And what he cites is St. Augustine's claim in a work that he wrote called, I believe it was on freedom of the will. I'm not entirely sure about that. But what Augustine claims is that a law that is not just does not seem to be a law at all. And Aquinas quotes this approvingly. And he uses this quote as a kind of jumping off point to talk about the relationship between the human law and the natural law. And what Aquinas takes Augustine's quote to be getting at is something like the following. Like if Aquinas could insert his own words, specifications into that Augustine quote, here's what Aquinas would say. He would say, a human law that contradicts the natural law that is not just is not a law at all. And we saw this idea when we were considering law in general, when we first started in on law. Aquinas lays out these 4 criteria that any law must meet. Law must be a command of reason, ordered toward the good, made by a proper authority, and promulgated. And essentially what Augustine is getting at, and what Aquinas takes Augustine to be getting at here, is that if a human law is not ordered toward the good, or is not, in fact, a command of reason, right, is arbitrary or unreasonable or irrational, or encourages vice or encourages injustice, well, it's not actually a law at all. It's not binding. You don't need to listen to it. Yeah, maybe the proper authorities made it. And, you had your congressmen and women and your governor or president or whoever sign off on it. And it's now on the books. And the police are going to enforce it. And the judges are going to punish you if you break it. That all might be true, but it still might not actually be a law. That's Aquinas's idea. That's Augustine's idea, arguably. This idea is what's been highly influential. And so what I want to share with you to close is one kind of very concrete example of this influence. This idea was really at the heart of the kind of civil rights activism that blossomed in the early 60s, championed by Martin Luther King Jr. And in what is perhaps King's most famous work, A Letter from Birmingham Jail, King cites Augustine and Aquinas at what is widely considered the crux of the letter, the crux of King's idea here, when he's trying to justify the civil rights movement. Essentially, he relies on this idea we've just been talking about. So Letter from a Birmingham Jail was written in response to criticisms of the kinds of actions that King was taking. So what King was doing at this time, he was organizing people, and he was organizing sit-ins in marches and so on, this kind of civil disobedience. And they were breaking the law. They were breaking segregation laws. So there were laws on the books that still required African Americans to stay out of certain places, to not use certain facilities, to do this or that, right? You still had kind of segregation. And so what King was doing at this time was kind of organizing, and in particular organizing African Americans to go occupy, sit in these places that it was technically illegal for them to be sitting in, right? Breaking the law. And so one um, criticism that King faced and that he's responding to, the main criticism he's responding to in Letter from a Birmingham Jail is, King, you and your the people you're helping organize here are breaking the law. You shouldn't break the law. That's not a good idea, right? Don't break the law. There's a kind of inconsistency about that or whatever. Here's how King responds. One may well ask, how can you advocating breaking some laws and obeying others? Because King was he would advocate for, in particular, what's in his mind here, and this comes up later, the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed the separate but equal overturn plus it doesn't matter, right? How can you advocate breaking some laws like these segregation laws and obeying others? Here's how King would respond. The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. And I'd be the first to advocate obeying just laws. You got a moral responsibility to do that. Fine. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Right? So there might be laws passed by legislatures, signed by all the right people on the books. The police are going to arrest you if you break them. The courts are going to punish you if you break them. They are not laws at all. And in fact, you have a moral responsibility to disobey them. You have a moral responsibility to expose yourself to the potential harm of being thrown in jail, right, for breaking this law that's not really a law. Now, what is the difference between the two? How can you say there's unjust laws and just laws? What's the difference? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? Here's King's answer. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law. You can think here, the natural law, or the law of God, right? That's the natural law he's talking about. He doesn't use that phrase. He uses it later, right? The moral law, the natural law. A just law, a just human law, squares with the natural law. As Aquinas would say, stems from the natural law, right? Very same idea here in King. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Eternal law, right? Natural law, of course, is just the eternal law as it applies to human beings. And so an unjust law is simply a human law that conflicts with the natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. What does that mean? Think of that in terms, right, to situate that in terms of Aquinas. Laws are supposed to order men toward the good, is the way Aquinas puts it. They're supposed to make people good. They're supposed to encourage goodness in people. They are supposed to benefit people, make people better, help people be happy, achieve happiness or beatitude, imperfect beatitude, as Aquinas would call it, right? That's the idea. Any law that does that, that's ordered toward the good, is just. That's ordered toward the human good, the common good, is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust, right? So any law that is not aimed at the good, but is actually detrimental to the good, detrimental to the common good, detrimental to the happiness of all the people, is unjust. And what King says is that all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. That is to say, segregation laws violate the common good. They are not ordered toward the happiness or beatitude of the people. They do not make people better. They make people worse. And King emphasized throughout his writings, yeah, obviously it hurts the African Americans who are harmed by these kinds of segregation laws, who are given inferior or who are given access only to inferior institutions and so on. That's obviously a kind of harm. But this comes out particularly in another letter that King wrote. No, it was a sermon actually called "Loving Your Enemies." King thinks something like a segregation statute also harms segregationists. And in Loving Your Enemies, he even goes so far as to say, the real harm might be, maybe not the real harm, the worst harm, put it that way, right? Being a victim of segregation laws is certainly a real harm. The worst harm, however, I think is the way he puts it in Loving Your Enemies, is to the segregationists, because that's damage to their soul. They are being made more unjust by following and encouraging segregationist policies and statutes. That's a harm to the soul, and harms to the soul are worse than whatever harms to the body, something like that. Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, so Brown versus Board of Education, for it's morally right. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong, right? And so this is how King justifies the kind of civil disobedience that he engaged in. He rests it almost entirely on this idea from Aquinas, this Thomistic understanding of the relationship between human law and natural law, right? And so while in Aquinas, this idea might look kind of dry and abstract as specifications, as conclusions. Okay, fine, whatever, right? It's important to try to understand the actual real world impact that these ideas have. And this idea in particular from Aquinas was crucially kind of instrumental in helping someone like Dr. King think through his activism and what was appropriate and inappropriate, how to approach changing the institutions of society and ultimately trying to change the laws.